So one of the great things about kind of this PBR workflow in Substance Painter is that these fill layers and things almost operate with some of the same parameters as kind of our PBR nodes or Uber nodes or Uber shader nodes or whatever your render engine calls it is. So we can actually kind of get some basic materials just by tweaking a few parameters on a fill layer. So let's go ahead. I'm going to select counter to tile here. And what we can do here is create our fill layer, call this ceramic. Come in here, and then we can take our base color and let's give this a fun color. So I'm going to maybe push mine to a kind of yellow color there. And then I can come down here to the roughness, and I can take that roughness and kind of play with that glossiness until I get a more kind of glossy look there. And I'm just going to go ahead and rotate the light there and determine how glossy I want that to be. So right here I'm going to do around 0.1, and that kind of gives me a look where it's not too glossy, but it's pretty shiny there. We can go ahead and interrupt that glossiness in a bit, but you can see kind of by just adjusting those two parameters, we've created almost a glossy like ceramic surface. Now we can go in and add all these imperfections and things to get a more realistic material. But just these basic fill colors and parameters are very similar to how those shaders operate in our render engines. That being said, let's dive in here and look at how we can make this look a little bit more like a tile set. So first of all, we're going to want some surface imperfections here, so we can mess with those in the roughness. Now, first of all, I'm going to come up here. I don't think we need the metal for this one, so we're going to go ahead and just turn that one off. And then what we can do is come over here to our procedurals and kind of play with a few options we have here in the roughness node. Now I'm going to end up doing a couple layers here, but to get started, I'm going to look for kind of more of a grimier or kind of like wet spot look, something more smeared. So we have this grunge fingerprints here. And I think that's kind of good because you kind of get that kind of like smeared look like you've been using the tiles. So let's go ahead and drag this one here into the roughness, and you can choose any one you want. I've chosen grunge fingerprint smeared wide, and then you can adjust the parameters there. And we can go ahead and take a look at our roughness channel up here to get a better idea of what that's looking like. And you can even change the UV projection up here, so we can change that to triplanar, and that'll give us kind of a more uniform look there. Let's go ahead, change this to 5 on our scale, and that feels a bit more realistic in terms of proportions to me. And let's come back here to our material view, and we can see how that's kind of adding a good amount of kind of dirt and variety there. Now you can keep stacking those layers for more realism. I'm going to add a scratch layer and kind of end it there. So let's go ahead, add a fill layer, call this scratches. Let's turn off everything but the roughness. Let's switch over to our roughness view. We can now see that this roughness is overtaking our roughness. So let's come to our roughness view over here. Let's do a linear dodge add, and that will add that on top of there. And then we can come here, add scratches, and I'm gonna do grunge dirt scratchy or grunge dirt or grunge scratch generator. You can choose which one of those. Now, because my smear is already adding a lot of variety, I'm gonna go ahead with this one and just add scratches because I kind of want fine control over the scratches. I'm gonna drag that into my roughness there, and then that'll kind of pop up here and we can see those different layers there. If you want, you can turn off the ceramic so you can isolate that. Then you can kind of just play with the contrast and balance there. So I don't want so much contrast because I want a bit of variety, because rarely does a scratch go across in exactly the same depth. I'm going to change this to a triplanar projection, and I'm actually pretty happy with that kind of at default. If you want, you can maybe turn that scale up to get those scratches smaller, but I want them to be a little bit more noticeable. So I'm going to turn on my ceramic here, and then now I have a pretty good view there. And that's what I want, is I want those scratches to kind of take away some of the roughness. Let's come out to our material here. And if we rotate that, we can see how that's affecting the roughness. Now, I don't really want any of that to affect the height per se, because I don't want to do really like deep scratches or anything, since tile tends to be kind of hard. I would like to add some height variation, because I do feel like when you get in kind of these older or more kind of rustic looking tiles like we're using, there tends to be a little bit of variety in kind of the height of the tile, as if they're not perfectly smoothed over. So let's kind of try and find a nice kind of blurred texture in here. So maybe something like a cloud texture. If you want, you can even use a gradient or a smear. I'm going to search for just a cloud here. I'm probably going to use this clouds too. And I could drag that directly into the ceramic height, but I think I want a little bit more control. So what I'm going to do is create a fill layer here, call this height warp. Let's go ahead, drag our clouds into our height here. And you can see that how that's kind of affecting everything. So let's go ahead, let's look at our height map here. We'll go ahead, turn off all these other options here, leave our height on. And first we'll change this projection to triplanar. And we can see here that the details are a little too intense to get us the kind of like smooth warping effect we're looking for. So we go back to the material, we can see that that's kind of almost scaly looking, which is not what we want. So let's come back here to the height. So we can play with these filters. Now there's a couple filters in here that we can use. We could try using just the blur filter. There's also a warp filter, which may not be the best for this option, but I do want to show that filter since we haven't looked at it yet. And if we grab that warp filter, you can see that it'll kind of distort that in a similar way to how the slope blur does. And this is really good for sometimes when you set it to low values, like right around there, you can kind of use that to create stylized edges and things like that. And I think that's a start. So let's go ahead and add another filter. And then let's add a blur on top of that. And we'll just do a regular blur there. We can maybe set that up to 1.25. We can grab that warp and we can maybe crank that intensity to 2 to give us a bit more kind of detail under there. If you want, you can change the order and kind of play with that, but I don't want those harsh details coming through, like I said. So we'll go ahead, do a blur there. Let's come back out to our material view and see what we have now. And that's much more what I'm going for, though not that extreme of a height. So then what we can do is come up to our height here and we can actually lower this to, let's say maybe 10% might be a little low. We just want that to kind of barely shine through. I'm coming in around 20% there. Let's go back to our material and we can see that's kind of giving us a little bit of a warp texture there. I do think that I want that warp to be slightly larger. So I'm going to come in here to the scale and do 0.25. And there we go. That's kind of giving us like a few bumps around there, but nothing too extreme. So with that, we kind of have a good base for our ceramics, but I kind of like when ceramics have like a strong color like this, how they kind of almost like wear into the edges here. So let's go ahead and play with some of those smart materials. So let's grab our ceramic down here. Let's duplicate this and bring this to the top here. Let's call this ceramic edges. And we can go ahead and take a look at some of the various smart masks we have in here and maybe choose one of those. I've kind of shown you how to build them up from scratch, but we haven't done a ton of the like various smart options they have in here. And I'm looking for something kind of to stick around the edges of our object. So let's just take this dirt soft edges and see what that looks like, and we'll drag that on there. We're not going to see it at first, so let's go ahead and alt click here and get an idea of what we're seeing and if we like the look of that. So let's click our curvature map here. And then we can come down to the curvature here and we can begin playing with these parameters. So we've mentioned some of these before, but we haven't really gone in depth or detail, though I feel they're pretty self-explanatory. When you spin down the curvature, you then have kind of fine details for all of these. So based on that curvature map and your mesh map, it will then look at these and kind of determine what features are sharp all the way up to huge. And you can go through and play with those until you get something that you like. This isn't necessarily the effect I'm going for, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that curvature map and let's kind of play with another one here. So let's go ahead here and we're going to add a filter. Now if you want, you can experiment more with that warp filter we used earlier, but I'm going to kind of return to the slope blur because I think that's more appropriate for what we want here. Let's go ahead, add that slope blur. and we can see we're kind of getting chunkier results there. And I'm going to turn that intensity down a little bit, and you can maybe even play with the intensity divider there. And I'm just going to barely crank that, and that kind of gets me more of kind of like a painterly look, which is more what I want. You can play with the quality here, but I tend to leave that on kind of 1 almost every time. So with that being said, let's click off of our mask, and then let's come up here to our ceramic, make sure that's selected, come down here to our material. Let's maybe make this a slightly kind of oranger color there. Let's choose something a little more extreme at first to make sure we can actually see it. There we go. So we can see how much is affecting here. Now, one thing I want to talk about is that when you have these kind of mask editors, and if you're not happy with the contrast you're getting, they do have a levels that you can input here, and you can then see that you can kind of play with that and crank that up. So then if we do that, we can see that with those levels selected, we are able to kind of adjust that to make more of that come through, which is what I want there. And that looks like a good amount to me. Now there's a bit much back here, and we can address that in a second. But first, let me come back up here and let's choose a better color. So I just chose red as kind of a bright color to give us an idea of what we're looking at, but we can go ahead, we can color select right there in our viewport. And this does work if you drag it out of your window. So you can select colors if you have a palette off screen. But let's go ahead, let's bring this down a bit. Let's kind of shift this over to a bit more of an orange, and it looks like our value kind of dropped too much. We don't necessarily want such a desaturated color. I kind of want these colors to be brighter, so I'm just going to keep playing with that. And I'm going to kind of push it part of the way over to the red there. With that, we kind of have kind of like a little orange color, almost like it was orange and it kind of faded out over time or got dirty around the edges. Now let's look at this grout in between, and let's first grab everything we just did, hit Control G and call this tiles. Let's go ahead, click there. And then let's come up to all, and let's look for kind of like a grout looking material. I think that cement might accomplish what we want, or concrete. So I'm going to take this concrete simple, drag this on top, and that looks like grout right out of the gate. But if you want, you can make that a little bit darker, as we're going to go for kind of more of a black grout. And then we can add a black mask, come up here, go to our object, and because of the way this was modeled in the course, this makes this part really easy here. Let's make sure we got all the grout there. It's kind of hard to tell with the wireframe on. Let's go ahead, click in here. And that looks like we got everything. Now, if I was going to go ahead and refine this, I would come in here and maybe paint this out a bit, as we've kind of shown how to do, because I don't think that we'd want it quite this far up on the edge here. And just every once in a while, you know, depending on your geometry and how complex it is or how simple it is, you're going to run into small issues like this. And as we've shown before, you can kind of go in there and correctively paint that out with paint layers and things like that. So I can add a paint layer here and kind of maybe paint that out if I wanted. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but with that paint layer on top, it'll affect the mask underneath. I can grab a basic soft mask and maybe just paint some of that out. I'm going to turn my flow way down because I don't want to affect it too much. And with that, that'll just kind of prevent it from being too extreme. And it actually looks okay on this side. I can maybe paint out 1 or 2 spots there. And we'll just do that for now. If you want, you can spend more time with it. We can come over here with our grout and select this mask again and grab there and the one up here. And that looks like we have everything except for the one here. And there we go. With that, we kind of have a basics tile to work with. And that's really kind of an example of how you can go about just creating a material with just a few fill layers and not much else. So now we can go ahead, take these concrete simples and these tiles, we can copy these layers, we can come down here to the sink tile, which is this piece back here, right click, paste layers, and that should automatically apply there. And you can see that the mask is ever so slightly off. If you're intent on fixing that, you can go in there. We can grab this mask. We can clear that mask by hitting clear mask right there above roof mask. And then we can go in here and select our grout. Looks like these are all individual pieces. And just like that, we now have kind of our whole little kitchen tile done. So let's move on to working on the sink here. Now, because I have so many smart materials and things are kind of starting to slow down. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off these cabinets because they're kind of the main proponents there. We're just going to go ahead and leave these top pieces on.